Hi, I'm Barbara and welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to make strawberry preserves. Yes indeed, it's relatively easy and I'm going to use a recipe from my new favorite cooking guru, Kathy Barrow, whose book Mrs. Wheelbarrow's Practical Pantry is a must-have for anyone who wants to learn how to preserve food. You have to check out her website, it's terrific. So this recipe is good with any fruit. I like to pick my own fruit, which is one way to get good fresh fruit. But you can also pick it up at your local farmer's market, you can grow it yourself, or get it at your favorite grocery store. You need to make sure you have all the right tools for making preserves or jams. Start with the potato masher, or one like I have, to mash up the fruit. And then have a stirring spatula, and I would recommend a heat-resistant silicone stirring spatula. A jar lifter, which is one of the most important tools because you will use this to pull your jars out of really hot boiling water. The magnetic lid lifter, another vital tool. Then you need your bubble remover or headspace tool, which helps you measure the headspace at the top of your jars after you've put the preserves in, and also you use it to get all the bubbles out of the jar. A ladle and a funnel. Make sure you have a good candy thermometer, one that you can read as it goes up to 220 degrees. Then, of course, you need jars. I recommend using any kind of pint, half pint, or quarter pint jars, and lids. These are what seals in your jams, and then, of course, the screw lids which go on top. I'd also recommend having a good kitchen scale so that you can weigh your fruit before you begin the process. A good heavy-duty cast iron 5 to 7 quart pot. Then you can pick up a large canning pot, which you can find in many of the stores. I decided to go with a large pot that I've had for a long time. The most important part here is that you need a wire rack. The jars can't sit at the very bottom of the pot. They need to sit on that rack, otherwise they could explode. You need a colander to strain your fruit just before you begin the process of trying to cook the syrup, and a small pot to warm the lids just before you put them on the jars of preserves. And you also need lemons, a Granny Smith apple, and butter. I also have a small plate that's in the freezer, which I use to test whether my jam or preserves is ready, and I'll show you that shortly. Another vital tool that I have are stove gloves to protect my hands when I'm cooking the syrup and the jam because it splatters and it's hot. And then, of course, buy Mrs. Barrow's book, Mrs. Wheelbarrow's Practical Pantry. It's a great guide for how to do this and be successful. So let's get started making our strawberry preserves. You first want to stem and hull the strawberries. My favorite way of doing it is taking a straw, poking it through the bottom of the strawberry and pushing up the stem and pulling it out. Presto, you've got a strawberry that's been stemmed and hulled. Then you rinse your strawberries off and you take your potato masher and mash them down so you can get some of the juice out of the strawberries. Then you mix the strawberries with sugar and lemon. Mrs. Wheelbarrow's recommendation is 3 pounds of fruit, you need 3 cups of sugar. You can moderate that, which I do now by doing 3 pounds of fruit to 2.5 cups of sugar. It doesn't really affect the taste, it's just as good. You put that in, mix it all together, throw in any herbs that you want to add to it, and you cover it up and let it sit on your counter for about 2 hours to 24 hours. I usually put mine in the refrigerator, but she says you can leave it out on your counter for 24 hours. If you're going to leave it for longer than that, I would recommend putting it in the refrigerator. Now your fruit is ready. Take your fruit out of your refrigerator and pour it into a colander that is sitting on top of the pot that you're going to use to make the jam. Pour in the fruit. It takes maybe 15-20 minutes for all of the syrup to come out of the fruit. Just leave it there and let it sit. Take your strawberries in the colander, put it back in the bowl that you were using, push that aside and let it continue to drip. Okay, so I'm going to have my pot of water boiling here for my jars. My next big step is to take my candy thermometer, put it on the side of my pan, then I'll turn it up to high heat. It'll take about 10 to 15 minutes to boil, and I would recommend staying close by your pot. You don't have to stir it all the time. You need to let it get up to a boil, but once it starts boiling, you really do need to stay close and stir as frequently as you can to make sure it doesn't scorch the bottom of your pan. So once the water in your big pot is boiling, take your jars and carefully, using your jar lifter, place them inside. Try not to splash yourself, which is very easy if you're not careful. Again, my pot has a rack on the bottom so that the jars are sitting on the rack and not directly on the bottom of the pan. So once the water starts boiling again, let the jars sit in the boiling water for 10 minutes. Once that happens, you can turn the water off and just leave the jars in the warm water. So what you're seeing now is the beginning of what Mrs. Wheelbarrow calls the boil that won't stir down. You see all that foam. As it continues to boil, that foam will start to disappear, but you gotta keep stirring. And you keep stirring until the temperature on the candy thermometer reaches 220 degrees. And that could take another 10 to 15 minutes. I have this small pot that's been boiling and has hot water in it. When I'm ready, I'll probably turn it back on and just throw the lids and the screw tops on and just get those warmed so that these lids are warm and will fit easily onto the jars of preserves. So while this is continuing to boil to reach 220 and I'm at about 212, I got a little ways to go, I'm going to grate an apple. This is important because it's my pectin. You can use boxed pectin if you want, but Mrs. Wheelbarrow recommends using a green apple because there's so much natural pectin in the skin and in the apple itself. So I'm just going to grate it up, and as I get ready to throw in my fruit, I'll throw in the grated up apple as well, and I'll have pectin. So it does require patience. This has been boiling for about 15 minutes now, but as you can see, it looks kind of like a lazy boil, soft, lazy boil. And we are probably at 218, almost 220. Okay, I think we are at 220 now, which is the point at which I'm ready to put in my fruit. So I'll take my thermometer out, set it aside in the sink, and I'll pour in my fruit. The rest of the liquid that kind of came out of the bottom. This is where the stirring is very important constantly. You have to get it to a boil again that won't stir down. And this will take about 15 minutes again to get it to the point that it's jam. I'll also put in our pectin. Which is our green apple. This is my natural pectin. Mrs. Wheelbarrow has a lot of great ideas on how to get natural pectin that are in her book, The Practical Guide to Pantry. So I've been cooking this for about 3 minutes now, and one thing I would suggest is, you see a lot of the fruit is laying on top. Watch as the fruit sort of begins to sink a little and absorb the syrup that we made ahead of time. And just keep stirring it and just listen for the crackling sound. I'll let this cook another 7 minutes or so before I take it off. The smell of strawberry preserves, it's wonderful. I think this is just about done, so I'm going to take it off and set it aside for about a minute or two, and then we'll do a little test to see if it's preserves and is ready to be jarred. Either just before you take it off the burner or put the jam into the jars, stir in a ½ teaspoon of unsalted butter to give the jam a nice glossy look. Okay, now it's time to test our preserves to see if it's gelled into the preserves that we want. So, remember that small plate I told you about? it's been sitting in the freezer, which is where you should put it at the very beginning. Is have a plate that goes into your freezer when you get ready to start this whole process. So you take a spoonful of your preserves, put it on the plate, let it sit for a minute. So now this has been sitting for about a minute or two, and you kind of look to see if it's kind of wrinkly, and it is. And the big test is I take my finger and run it through, and does it leave a trail? Yep, it's ready. Delicious. Now let's get our jars ready. So take them out of the really hot pot where they've been sitting. You need your handy dandy jar lifter. Take each jar out, dump the water out, place it, I use a cookie sheet, place it on your cookie sheet. There you go. So now I bring my jars over here. And we begin jarring. Grab your funnel, place it on top of one of the jars, and use a soup, like I use a soup ladle, and just ladle into the jar. You want to fill it up to leaving a ½ inch at the very top, and we'll measure that when we're finished filling them up. So each of my jars has a ½ inch space at the top, and take the other side of this tool or even a chopstick and just go along the edge of the jar to get any bubbles. So the next step is really important, and that is to get a damp paper towel or a damp rag, anything that's a little bit damp, and make sure you wipe along the edge of the jar. You want to make sure there's no jam along the rim of the jar. Now we're ready to put our rims on. So they've been in this warm pot and they should be nice and ready. So you have this great little magnetic seal lifter. You take it off, you get a lid out rather, you put it on and just sort of push it down. Put it on, make sure it's sealed. Then I will loosely tighten on the top, not tight, loosely. And our final step is the final water bath to seal the jars. Take each jar that's been filled and sealed with a lid, put it back in the water that you had the jars in. Again, make sure if you're using a regular pan that there is some grate on the bottom so the jars are not sitting directly on the bottom of the pan, or just use a regular canning pot. Put it in and let it come to a boil. The jars need to boil for 10 minutes. And when the 10 minutes is up, we'll go to the final step. Okay, our water bath process is complete. And now, turn off the heat and take our jars out and wait to hear our ping. 1 ping, and that ping sound means they're properly sealed. 3 pings. Our jars are sealed and our strawberry preserves are complete. I hope you enjoyed this. Try it. It's easy.